Are you the Fields woman arriving from Omaha?
There is nothing left for me here.
Amara Fields had grown used to being turned away with polite letters, but never to being refused outright in front of a room full of strangers. Jedediah Colton had 60 days to marry a lawful wife or lose his father's ranch to a man waiting for him to fail. He didn't need a woman to save his pride. He needed someone who wouldn't bow her head to anyone, not even to him. And the moment he saw her standing straight-backed in a store that had just laughed at her, he knew he'd found exactly that. The Union Pacific pulled into Cheyenne at 2:15, and Amara Fields stepped down onto a platform crowded with freight crates, a shouting stock agent and the particular smell of coal smoke mixed with cattle pens somewhere close by. She had her bag in one hand and a folded letter of introduction in the other, and for the first 10 minutes, she believed everything was exactly as arranged. It wasn't. A boy from the telegraph office found her by the ticket window, asked if she was the Fields woman coming in from Omaha, and handed her an envelope instead of a greeting. The Ashworth family regretted to inform her that their household circumstances had changed, and her position as housekeeper was no longer needed. A bank draft for 1 week's wages was folded inside, meant she understood to close the matter cleanly. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and put it in her coat pocket because there was nothing else useful to do with it. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying changed nothing about a letter that had already been written and sent. With nowhere arranged to sleep and no one in Cheyenne expecting her, she asked a station hand for the nearest place that might need a hand for hire, and he pointed her toward Fenwick's Dry Goods, which kept a hiring notice in the window most weeks. She walked the 2 blocks with her bag still in hand, rehearsing the plain, practical sentence she'd learned to open with, "I'm looking for honest work, and I don't need charity, only a chance to prove myself." She never got past the first half of it. The store was full when she stepped inside a Saturday crowd of ranch wives and clerks, the kind of crowd that noticed a stranger before the door had even swung shut. The woman behind the counter, thin-mouthed and quick with her eyes, looked Amara over once head to boots before Amara had said more than her name. "We're not hiring," the woman said, loud enough to carry to the back shelves. "Not you, not here." She said it the way a person swats at something bothersome, without any particular heat, which somehow made it worse. A few customers near the counter turned to look, not to help, only to watch. Someone near the flour barrels laughed under their breath quickly and didn't bother hiding it. Amara felt the heat climb up her neck, the old familiar heat of being looked at like a problem that had wandered somewhere it didn't belong. She had stood through worse than this in worse towns. She made herself stand through it now, spine straight, chin level, giving the room nothing further to feed on. "I only asked if there was work," she said evenly. "Not for anything else." "There isn't. Not for you." The woman had already turned to the next customer, done with her, the dismissal so complete it left no room for a reply. Amara picked up her bag and walked out with the particular steadiness of someone who had trained her body not to hurry, even when every part of her wanted to. The bell over the door rang behind her, too cheerful for the moment it was marking. She was 3 steps down the boardwalk when a man's voice stopped her. "You didn't deserve that." She turned. He was tall, sun-worn, dressed plainly enough that she took him for a rancher rather than a merchant. He'd been near the back of the store, she realized now, close enough to have heard all of it. His jaw was tight in a way that told her the words had cost him some effort to hold back inside the store itself. "I've had worse said to me in nicer rooms," she said, because it was true and because she didn't need his anger added to her own. "Doesn't make it right." He studied her a moment, the way a man studies a fence line before deciding whether it needs mending now or can wait. Vale House takes boarders. 2 streets north. Mrs. Vale won't treat you like that woman just did. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than the plainness of her voice let on. He touched the brim of his hat and started toward the bank across the street. Then stopped, turned back half a step, as if something had occurred to him that hadn't quite finished forming. You looking for work in town or just passing through? I was supposed to have work. It didn't hold. She nodded toward the store behind her. As you saw, something crossed his face, not quite sympathy, more like recognition of a thing he understood the shape of even if not the particulars. Name's Jedediah Colton. Ranch 12 miles out. Might be I need somebody who can keep a house and doesn't flinch when a room turns unkind. He paused. I'm not offering anything today. Just asking if that's a conversation you'd want to have. She looked at him, really looked the way she'd learned to look at people who mattered before deciding what to think of them, and found none of the careful cruelty she'd just walked away from. I'd want to have that conversation, she said. He told her to come by the mercantile at 9 the next morning, then walked on toward the bank with a set to his shoulders that told her whatever business waited for him, there wasn't going to be easy either. Amara found Vale House without much trouble, and Mrs. Vale, true to his word, looked her over once decided whatever she needed to decide, and quoted her a fair rate without a single unkind word attached to it. That night, counting what remained of her money on the narrow bed, she found herself thinking less about the woman at the counter than about the man who'd stopped on the boardwalk to say she hadn't deserved it. Strangers rarely bothered. She didn't yet know what to make of one who had. The Territorial Trust Bank of Cheyenne kept its unpleasant business in a back office with a good view of the street, which Elias Whitcomb had always privately thought was a mistake, though not one he was in a position to correct. He sat across from Jed Colton that morning with a folder open between them and the particular discomfort of a man who liked the person across the table and disliked the news he was required to deliver. Your father's note carried a marriage clause, Whitcomb said. It's unusual, I'll grant you, but it's there in his own hand, witnessed and filed. The Bar Diamond stays in Colton ownership only if the ranch has a legally married household head within 1 year of his passing. That year is up in 60 days. Why would he write that? Because Silas Pruitt held half the note with the bank, and your father didn't trust a bachelor operation to hold the line against a man who's been trying to fold the Bar Diamond into Pruitt Cattle Company for a decade. Whitcomb closed the folder. He was protecting you, Jed, in his way. Jed didn't answer that right away. He had buried his father 4 months ago and was still finding new ways the man had reached past his own death to keep managing things. And if I don't marry, then the note transfers and Pruitt has first right to purchase at the bank's assessed value, which he will set very low because he sits on the assessment committee. Whitcomb said this plainly, the way a man states a fact he has already tried and failed to argue his way around. I'm sorry. I've looked for another reading of the clause. There isn't one. Jed rode back out to the Bar Diamond, with that sitting in him like a stone swallowed whole 12 miles of dry autumn grass and a sky too big to offer any particular comfort. He found Amos Whitlock at the corral 40 years on this land, and still moving like a man who trusted his own hands more than most people's promises. You look like a man who lost an argument with a fence post, Amos said. Jed told him. Amos listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was its own kind of answer, because Amos interrupted everything. 60 days, Amos said finally. That's not a lot of courting. I'm not looking to court anybody. I'm looking to keep this ranch out of Silas Pruitt's hands. Jed dismounted, looped the reins over the rail. There's a woman in town, Fields, lost a position she came out here for. She can keep a house, and she struck me as somebody who wouldn't waste my time asking questions she already knew the answers to. You thinking what I think you're thinking. I'm thinking I need help running this house before I can think about anything past that." Amos gave him a long look that suggested he didn't entirely believe that was the whole of it, but he let it go because that was also a kind of loyalty. The next morning, Jed met Amara Fields outside the mercantile, and the conversation he'd planned to have about housekeeping wages turned out to be easier than he expected, mostly because she asked practical questions and didn't wrap them in anything soft. "What would the position require?" she said. "Managing the house. The books, some I've let them go since my father passed, and I don't trust my own arithmetic under pressure. Meals for myself and my foreman." He hesitated on the next part. "It would be temporary to start. A trial. 2 weeks. And the wages." He named a figure. She didn't flinch at it, which told him something about how little she'd been offered before. "I'll need a place to stay that isn't costing me money I don't have while I decide if this is worth staying for," she said. "There's a room off of the kitchen. It was my mother's sewing room. It's got a proper door and a window." She considered him for a moment, in the frank, unhurried way he was coming to recognize as simply how she looked at things she meant to understand fully before agreeing to them. "I'll take the trial," she said. 2 weeks. He didn't tell her about the 60 days. He told himself it wasn't a lie, only a thing that didn't need saying yet. And he rode her out to the Bar Diamond in the wagon, with that unspoken arithmetic sitting behind every ordinary question she asked about the property. Along the way, how many head of cattle, how far to the nearest doctor, whether the well ever ran short in summer. She was, he noticed, the kind of person who asked questions because she wanted the true answer, not because she wanted something to say. He found that he answered her more fully than he generally answered anybody, and he wasn't entirely sure what to do with that discovery, so he did what he usually did with things he wasn't sure about. He set it aside and pointed out the north pasture instead, and let the ranch speak for itself the rest of the way in. The Bar Diamond sat off Horsehead Road, behind a stand of cottonwoods that had gone gold with the season, and the house itself was solid, but unmistakably a house that had been missing a steady hand since spring. Amos Whitlock met the wagon at the yard with the particular squint of a man deciding what he thought of a new arrangement before he'd said a word about it. "Miss Fields," Jed said. "Amos Whitlock. Runs the operation as much as I do whatever he tells you." "More than you do," Amos said, and shook her hand with a grip that meant it. "You cook." "I do. Good. Man's been living on beans and his own poor judgment since October." Amos said it without malice, the plain teasing of a man who'd earned the right to it, and Jed didn't argue the point, which Amara noted and filed away as its own kind of information about how these two men spoke to each other. The kitchen, when she saw it, told her the same story the yard had. Not neglected exactly, but unattended pots stacked without order, a pantry with good bones and no organization, a stove that had clearly been used hard and cleaned rarely. She set her bag down in the small room off the kitchen, which did indeed have a proper door and a window that looked east toward a line of hills going blue in the afternoon light, and she stood there a moment, taking the measure of it, the way she took the measure of every room she'd ever been given. Smaller than some, better kept than others. It would do. She made supper that evening from what the pantry offered: salt pork, dried beans, a cornbread she put together from memory rather than a recipe, because Mrs. Carver back in Omaha had drilled the proportions into her hands years ago, whether she liked it or not. Jed ate 2 helpings without much comment beyond a nod that she was beginning to understand counted in him as real praise. Amos ate with the frank enjoyment of a man who had missed being cooked for more than he'd admit. "Better than Tuesday," Amos said. "I wasn't here Tuesday," Jed said. "That's my point exactly. After the dishes." Jed walked the property boundaries with her at a distance that felt less like supervision and more like a man showing something he was quietly proud of, even if he'd never say so outright. He pointed out the porch board. on the south side that had gone soft with rot, the barn hinge that stuck in cold weather, the well that had never once run dry in 11 years, no matter what the summer did to everyone else's. "You've kept records of the herd," she said, noticing a ledger left open on the porch rail from earlier work. "But not the household. Never needed to before." He said it simply, not defensively, and something in the plainness of it told her more than the words did, that there had been someone once who managed all of this without him needing to think about it, and that her absence was still a shape cut into the daily running of the place, even 4 months on. "Was that your mother's room I'm in?" "My mother's, then my sister's, before she married and moved to Laramie. Empty since." He looked toward the house instead of at her, which she was learning was where his eyes went, when a subject sat a little too close to something he didn't discuss easily. "It's a good room. Gets the morning light." She didn't press further. There would be time or there wouldn't, and either way, it wasn't hers to pull loose before he was ready to hand it over himself. That night, lying in the narrow bed with the window cracked to the cooling air, she found herself doing the thing she'd trained herself out of doing in every previous position, letting herself wonder just slightly whether this one might hold. She caught the thought early and set it down carefully, the way you'd set down something breakable you weren't ready to trust yourself to carry yet. But she noticed, too, a smaller and more specific thing nagging at her from the porch conversation. Jed Colton had come out of the bank in town with a look on his face like a man carrying bad news he hadn't yet found the words for, and in 2 days at the Bar Diamond, he still hadn't said what it was. She had spent her whole working life reading the difference between what people said and what they were bracing themselves to say eventually. Whatever this was, she suspected was coming. She closed her eyes on that thought and let the ranch's unfamiliar quiet carry her the rest of the way to sleep. The 2-week trial had 11 days left in it when Jed finally said the thing he'd been carrying since the bank office, and he said it badly, which surprised her because in every other matter she'd watched him handle since arriving, he was a man who chose his words with care. It was after supper. Amos had gone to check the horses, which she was coming to understand was the excuse he used whenever he sensed a conversation coming that wasn't his to sit through. Jed set his coffee cup down without drinking from it and looked at the table instead of at her, and she recognized the posture from that first day outside the bank, a man bracing. "There's a clause in my father's note," he said. "The bank holds it, and Silas Pruitt holds half of it alongside them. It requires the ranch have a married household head inside a year of my father's passing, or the note transfers and Pruitt gets first purchase at whatever price the assessment committee names which he sits on." He finally looked up. "I have 51 days left." The kitchen went very still. She set down the cloth she'd been folding. "You hired me 11 days ago," she said, and said nothing. "I didn't know how to ask what I'm about to ask you, without you thinking the 2 weeks were a lie from the start." He held her gaze, which she gave him credit for even now. "They weren't. I needed a housekeeper regardless of the clause, but I also need the bank needs a wife, a real one on paper and in the courthouse record, not a housekeeper wearing a different title." He paused, choosing the next part with visible effort. "I'm not asking you to pretend at something. I'm asking you to consider a real arrangement. Terms we'd set ourselves. I won't treat you as staff dressed up to satisfy a banker's clause. This ranch needs a wife, not a servant, and if you agreed to it, that's what you'd be, my wife, with everything that's owed to the word, whatever else is or isn't true between us yet." Amara sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, the way she turned over every offer that had ever come dressed as help. She had heard versions of generosity before that turned out on closer inspection to require her gratitude more than her consent. "You're asking me to marry you to save your ranch from a man named Pruitt," she said, to make certain she understood it correctly without softening. "Yes, and in exchange, security you don't currently have. A home that's legally as much yours as mine the day the clerk signs the record. Wages continue regardless if that's the only part of this you want. He stopped, and something in his face shifted some effort at honesty beyond the practical terms. And my word that I won't treat this as a debt you owe me for taking you in. I know what that would feel like, being handed kindness with a bill attached. I'm not offering that. She thought of the Ashworth letter still folded in her coat pocket, of every position that had ended in a polite note, explaining she wasn't quite what was wanted. She thought, too, of how differently this offer had been made, not as charity, not as pity, but as a plain transaction between two people who each had something the other needed, stated, without dressing it up as more than it was. I need time, she said. I won't answer tonight. I wasn't expecting you to. He stood, collected his still full coffee cup, and paused at the doorway. Whatever you decide, the housekeeping position holds either way. I want that understood plainly. This isn't a threat dressed as an offer. I understand that, she said, and she found somewhat to her own surprise that she did. He left her alone in the kitchen, with the lamp burning low, and the ledger from the porch rail still sitting where he'd left it days before, its columns of cattle counts and feed costs suddenly carrying a different weight than they had that afternoon. She did not decide that night. She sat a long while instead, turning the offer over from every angle she knew how to examine a thing, searching for the catch she had learned through 12 years of careful disappointment to always look for first. She did not find one. That unsettled her almost more than finding one would have. She gave him her answer 3 days later, and when she did, she gave it with conditions attached, because she had learned that agreements made without conditions were agreements made on someone else's terms alone, and she did not intend to enter this one that way. I'll marry you, she said over breakfast, plainly the same way he'd made the offer. On terms. He set down his fork. Name them. I'm addressed as your wife, not your housekeeper, from the day it's signed in this house and in town both. I have a say in how the household runs, not just the keeping of it. If either of us decides this isn't working, we say so to each other directly, not through a lawyer or a letter left with someone else. She held his eyes. And you tell me the truth even when it costs you something to tell it. I've had enough of finding things out sideways. Agreed, he said without hesitation on any point, which told her something about how much thought he'd already given to what she might ask. Anything else? The porch board gets fixed before winter. Amos mentioned it twice and you've done nothing about it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, the closest she'd yet seen him come to an actual smile. I'll fix the board. They were married 8 days later at the county courthouse in Cheyenne, in a ceremony that lasted under 10 minutes and involved a clerk who had clearly performed the same brief service 100 times before, and a witness pulled from the hallway outside, a stranger named Perkins, who signed the register and left without further comment. Amos stood beside them because Jed had asked him to, and he wore for the occasion a coat Amara suspected he hadn't put on since some funeral or another. There was no ring exchanged in any ceremonial sense, only a plain band Jed had bought that morning from Fenwick's Dry Goods, which he slid onto her hand with the careful, slightly graceless attention of a man performing an unfamiliar task correctly rather than romantically. She found she didn't mind the plainness of it. It matched the honesty of everything else between them so far. Mrs. Colton, the clerk said, closing the register, and Amara heard the name settle over her with a strange weight, not unwelcome, only unfamiliar, like a coat that fit but hadn't yet been worn in. Their first supper as husband and wife was by any romantic measure unremarkable. Amos joined them at the table as he always did, and the conversation covered feed prices and a fence line needing repair on the north boundary, and if a stranger had walked in without knowing what the morning had held, they might have taken the three of them for exactly what they had been the week before. But there was a new carefulness in how Jed passed her the bread, in how he asked, unprompted, whether the room still suited her, or whether she wanted anything moved or added, now that it was legally as much her house as his. "It suits me," she said. "For now." "For now," he agreed. And there was something in the way he said it, not pressing, just leaving room, that she noted, and did not yet know what to do with. That night, she wrote nothing in any letter, because there was no one left to write to who would understand what she'd just done. And she sat instead at the small writing table in her room, with the lamp turned low, looking at the plain band on her finger, in a light that made it look neither grand nor small, only real. She had married a man to save his land from a stranger named Pruitt. On terms she had set herself with a promise of honesty she intended to hold him to. It was not the marriage she might once have imagined for herself in some earlier, less careful version of her own hoping. But it was hers chosen with her eyes open, and there was a particular kind of strength in that which she had not expected to feel this soon. Outside, she could hear Jed and Amos still talking low on the porch. Unhurried, the ordinary sound of two men closing out a day. Tomorrow, the whole town would know. She closed her eyes on that thought, and let herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, feel something closer to steady than braced. News in Cheyenne moved faster than the Union Pacific, and by the time Amara walked into Fenwick's dry goods 4 days after the courthouse, every woman in the shop already knew precisely who she was and had already formed an opinion about what her marriage meant. Loretta Fenwick ran the till herself that morning, and she greeted Amara with a smile calibrated to look warmer than it was. "Mrs. Colton," she said, testing the name in her mouth like something she wasn't sure she believed. "We'd heard. Quite sudden, wasn't it?" "It was efficient," Amara said, which was true and gave Loretta nothing further to work with. Jed Colton's always been a careful man, careful about his ranch, especially since his father passed. Loretta folded her hands on the counter. It must be a comfort to him having someone to manage the house on such short notice, though I imagine some might wonder at the timing of it all, given the note his father left. There it was, laid down gently enough to be deniable. Amara understood immediately that the marriage clause was no longer a private matter between Jed and a bank office, that somehow through Whitcomb's clerk or Pruitt's own mouth, it had already found its way into the current of town talk, and her marriage was being read now not as a private choice, but as a convenient rescue arranged for a deadline rather than a person. "I imagine some might," Amara said evenly. "I'll take my order if you have it ready." She paid, gathered her parcel, and left without giving Loretta the satisfaction of a longer conversation, but she carried the exchange with her, the whole walk back through town, turning it over, recognizing the particular shape of it. She had been assessed and found suspicious before in other towns for other reasons. This one had a familiar weight to it, even with an unfamiliar cause. She did not tell Jed that evening at first. It was Amos who mentioned it 3 days later with the blunt directness she was coming to rely on in him. "Loretta Fenwick's been talking," Amos said to Jed over coffee before Amara had come in from the yard. "Saying the marriage was a bank dodge, that you found yourself a convenient bride to beat the clause and dressed it up nice." Jed's jaw went tight in the particular way Amara had learned to read as controlled anger rather than surprise. "Since when?" "Since Whitcomb's boy can't hold his tongue at the saloon is my guess. Or Pruitt's been talking it around himself, which wouldn't surprise me any more than the sun coming up." The next morning, Jed rode into town for supplies he didn't strictly need, and Amara, watching him go, understood, without being told, exactly where else he intended to stop. She learned the shape of what happened only second-hand from Amos, who'd heard it from a ranch hand, who'd been in the bank lobby at the time that Jed had walked in, found Whitcomb at his desk with Pruitt himself present, discussing some unrelated matter of range rights, and said plainly in front of both men and whoever else happened to be standing near enough to hear that his wife was not a housekeeper hired to satisfy a clause, and that anyone in Cheyenne who wanted to say otherwise could say it to his face instead of Loretta Fenwick's counter. He did not raise his voice by every account she heard. He did not need to. The plainness of it was its own force. When he came home that evening, he said nothing about it himself, only handed her the supplies and asked whether the porch board repair had held through the week's weather. She let him have the silence because she understood by now that this was simply how he carried things, not spoken aloud, unless directly asked, but acted upon all the same. It held, she said. Thank you for town. He looked at her, and for a moment, the careful distance he generally kept in his expression gave way to something plainer. Wasn't for you, he said. Was for the truth of it. Though I suppose those come to the same thing most days. She found standing there in the yard, with the light going long and gold behind him, that she believed him completely, and that the belief settled into her chest with a warmth she hadn't given herself permission to feel, yet not fully, not until this exact moment. The trouble did not stay contained to gossip for long. 2 weeks after the courthouse, Whitcomb sent word to the Bar Diamond, requesting Jed and Amara both appear at the bank the following Thursday, and the careful formality of the request told Jed before he'd even opened the envelope fully that something had shifted from talk into official business. Pruitt's raised a question with the loan committee, Whitcomb said once they were seated across from him in the same back office where Jed had first heard about the marriage clause. He looked genuinely uncomfortable delivering this. About whether the marriage satisfies the note's intent, or whether it was his word, a contrivance arranged solely to defeat the transfer provision. He's asked the committee to require proof of a bona fide union before certifying the clause met. Proof, Amara repeated. What would that require? Truthfully, there's no fixed standard for it. Testimony mostly. Whether the household is genuinely shared, whether the marriage carries the ordinary substance of one. Whitcomb glanced between them, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. I don't say this gladly, but if the committee finds cause to doubt it, the clause could be read as unmet, and the note transfers regardless of the ceremony having occurred. Jed's hands, Amara noticed, had gone very still on the arms of his chair. And if we simply tell them the truth, that it began as an arrangement to meet the clause. I'd advise against volunteering that particular phrasing, Whitcomb said carefully. Whatever the beginning of it was, Jed, what matters to this committee is where it stands now. They rode home from that meeting, mostly in silence. The wagon wheels loud against the dry road, both of them turning over a question neither had fully asked the other. Yet not whether the marriage would survive scrutiny, but whether it deserved to survive it, or whether they had built something too thin to hold the weight now being placed on it. It was Amara who spoke first once the ranch came into view. I won't sit in front of that committee and perform something I don't feel, she said. I'll tell the truth of it, whatever that truth turns out to be. I won't lie to keep your land, Jed, even for you. I wouldn't ask you to. He pulled the horses up outside the barn and sat a moment without moving to climb down. I don't want you performing anything either. I'd rather lose the ranch honestly than keep it on a lie you had to carry for me. She looked at him in the fading light, surprised by the plainness of that, by how completely he'd meant it. You'd rather lose it. I'd rather not ask you to be less than exactly what you are, to keep something that was never worth more than that to begin with. He said it looking straight ahead, at the barn, at nothing in particular, the way he said most things that cost him something to say. I've been turning over what's true since Loretta Fenwick started talking, and I'll tell you plainly since you asked me for that once, and I gave my word. It stopped being only about the clause for me somewhere around the second week. I don't know the exact day. The yard was quiet, except for the horses shifting in their traces. Amara sat with that for a long moment, feeling something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight since the courthouse. It stopped being only that for me, too, she said. I didn't want to say it first in case I was wrong about what I was feeling. You weren't wrong. Neither of them moved to close the distance further that evening. It wasn't that kind of moment, not yet, not with a bank committee, still weighing their marriage like a ledger entry that hadn't balanced. But something had been said plainly between them that neither could take back or pretend afterward hadn't been meant, and that Amara thought walking into the house ahead of him was its own kind of proof, whatever the committee eventually decided. 3 nights before the committee was set to reconvene, Amara sat at the kitchen table with the ranch's ledgers spread in front of her. Not because Jed had asked her to look at them, but because she had spent enough evenings now managing the household accounts to have developed an eye for where numbers sat comfortably and where they didn't. And something in the herd tallies from that spring had been nagging at her since she'd first organized the pantry stores against them weeks earlier. She found it a little past 10 by lamplight and sat back from the table with the particular stillness of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion she'd hoped would turn out to be nothing. Jed. He came in from the front room where he'd been going over fence repairs with Amos, and something in her voice brought him to the table without a word. The spring tally your father recorded doesn't match the count Pruitt's men logged at the joint roundup in May, she said, turning the ledger to face him. 41 head short according to your father's book. But the joint roundup record, the one filed with the Stock Growers Association, shows the full count present and accounted for that day. Meaning either your father miscounted 41 cattle in his own herd, which doesn't match anything else I've seen in how carefully he kept these books, or someone folded 41 bar diamond head into the Pruitt Cattle Company tally that day and never corrected the record afterward. She looked up at him. If that's true and it's provable, it says something about exactly the kind of man Silas Pruitt is being to your family, well before any bank clause came into it. Jed sat down slowly, turning the pages back and forth between the 2 records, and Amos, who had followed him in, leaned over his shoulder with the same sharpening attention. I remember that roundup, Amos said. Ran short-handed that week. 2 of Pruitt's riders helped move our stock, same as ours moved theirs. Wouldn't have been hard for a few head to drift the wrong direction if nobody was counting close on both sides. Or if somebody made sure nobody was counting close, Amara said. It took the better part of the next 2 days to run the thread down properly. Amara wrote to the Stock Growers Association's recording clerk in Cheyenne, requesting the original brand inspection tallies from that roundup. Phrased carefully enough, a skill she'd sharpened these past weeks to sound like a routine records request rather than an accusation. The tallies came back 4 days later, and they showed in the inspector's own hand 41 head bearing the Bar Diamond brand, recorded as delivered to Pruitt's holding pen that day and never returned. It didn't resolve the marriage question the bank committee was set to weigh. But it did something else, something Jed hadn't expected when he'd first handed her the household books weeks ago, mostly to keep her occupied while she settled in. It proved in black ink on an official form that Silas Pruitt's interest in the Bar Diamond wasn't new business born of a convenient bank clause. It was old business years in the making, and the marriage requirement had simply handed him a fresh tool for something he'd already been quietly attempting. You found this? Jed said, looking at her across the table, the lamp burning low between them, going through books nobody asked you to go through. I go through what needs going through, she said. That's what you married, if you'll recall the terms. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, and not quite something more serious than one recognition, maybe, of exactly what he had sitting across from him, with ink on her fingers, and a ledger that had just quietly changed the shape of everything. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, over the page, not moving, it just resting there. I knew what I was asking for when I made the offer, he said. I don't think I understood yet what I was getting. She didn't pull her hand back. The kitchen was quiet, except for the lamp's small, steady hiss and outside the last of the season's crickets kept up their thin autumn chorus against a night that felt for the first time since the courthouse less like something they were surviving and more like something they were building. The fire started on the Pruitt side of the boundary fence from a cook fire left unwatched by a line camp crew, and the wind that had been dry and steady all week carried it across the dead autumn grass faster than any rider could outrun with a warning. Amos saw the smoke first from the barn, a little after 4 in the afternoon, and by the time Jed had the horses saddled, the sky to the north had gone the color of old iron. Amara was already at the tack room pulling down every burlap sack the ranch owned, soaking them in the horse trough, with hands that didn't shake, even though her chest had gone tight and cold the moment she understood what was coming. "You don't have to ride out for this," Jed said, swinging up onto his horse. "The herd's on the North Range," she said. "You'll need every hand you've got, and I can beat a fire line same as anybody with 2 arms." She was already tying the wet sacks across her saddle. "We're not arguing about this, Jed. We're riding." He didn't argue. There wasn't time, and some part of him she would understand only later had simply trusted her to be right. The next 3 hours blurred into smoke and heat, and the particular screaming panic of cattle that could smell danger faster than they could be made to understand which direction safety lay. They worked the fire line in the fading light with wet sacks and shovels, and when those ran short, coats stripped off and beaten against the flame's leading edge, choking on smoke that turned the sunset the color of a wound. Amos drove a portion of the herd south through a gap in the fence toward the creek, shouting himself hoarse. Jed and 2 hired men cut a fire break along the ridge where the grass thinned, working with the grim, wordless efficiency of men who had done this before and knew exactly how much was at stake if the line didn't hold. Amara worked the gap between them, running water and dry sacks between the 2 crews, beating out spot fires that leapt the break before they could spread further, and at one point, turning back toward where she'd last seen Jed, she lost him entirely in a wall of smoke thick enough to swallow a man whole. Her heart went to ice in a way the fire itself hadn't managed. "Jed," he emerged out of the smoke a moment later, coughing, his sleeve scorched through at the cuff, and the relief that went through her at the sight of him was so total and so unguarded that she didn't have time to arrange her face into anything more careful before he saw exactly what had been on it. "I'm here," he said, closing the distance between them, gripping her shoulder with a hand that wasn't entirely steady either. "I'm here." They held the line until well past dark, until the wind finally dropped, and the fire starved of fresh grass, ahead of the break guttered down into smoldering patches that the men could finish stamping out by lantern light. The herd was accounted for minus a handful of head still to be gathered come morning. The house and barn stood untouched, the fire having turned north before it ever reached the home pasture. They rode back to the yard, in the deep, exhausted quiet that follows a thing survived rather than merely finished, and it was there, dismounting in the dark, with soot on both their faces and her hands raw from the shovel, that Jed reached for her before either of them had said a word, and she went to him without hesitation, without the careful measuring distance either of them had kept, even after the truth had been spoken plainly in the wagon weeks before. "I thought I'd lost the smoke on you out there," she said against his shoulder, her voice rougher than she meant it to be. "I don't know what I'd have done." "You wouldn't have had to do anything," he said. "I'd have found my way back to you. That was never in question, not once tonight." Neither of them said more than that. They didn't need to. Something that had been building slow and careful across weeks of ledgers and courtroom formality and town gossip had finally, in the space of one terrible afternoon, become entirely unmistakably real, and they stood in the dark yard a long while simply holding on to that and each other before either one remembered there was still a barn to check and horses to settle for the night. The bank committee met on a Thursday in late November, and Elias Whitcomb opened the proceedings by reading into the official record an account of the North Range fire that had reached town within a day of it happening, carried as most things were in Cheyenne faster than any rider could have managed alone. He read the brand inspection findings on the 41 missing head next entered as supporting testimony regarding the general character of the dispute between the Bar Diamond and Pruitt Cattle Company. Silas Pruitt, present at the meeting, offered no rebuttal to either account. There wasn't one available to him that would hold. The committee finds the marriage clause satisfied in both letter and intent, Whitcomb said, closing the file with what Amara suspected was more relief than the proceedings strictly called for. The note remains with the Colton family in good standing. This matter is concluded. Loretta Fenwick, who had somehow secured herself a seat at the back of the room for the proceedings, left without meeting anyone's eye on the way out, and word reached the Bar Diamond within the week that she'd been considerably quieter on the subject of the Colton marriage since. Amara did not seek her out for any accounting of it. Some corrections she had learned were better left to arrive on their own time. It was that evening, back at the ranch with Amos gone to bed early, and the November wind finally turning cold enough to mean winter wasn't far off, that Jed said the thing he'd apparently been carrying since the courthouse steps, unspoken, beneath every practical arrangement they'd built since. "I need to say something," he said, "and I'd like to say it plainly, since that's the only way I know how to say anything that matters." She set down her mending and waited. "I married you to keep this ranch out of Pruitt's hands. That's the truth, and I won't pretend otherwise, because you asked me once never to give you less than the truth, and I intend to keep that." He looked at her steadily. "But somewhere in the weeks, since that stopped being the reason, and I don't think it was ever really the whole reason even at the start. I think I knew standing outside that store the first day I saw you that I wanted to know you, regardless of any clause my father left behind. I just didn't have the words for it yet, and then there wasn't time to find them before I needed an answer from you about something else entirely." "You have the words now," she said. "I do." He reached for her hand, the same plain gesture he'd used to slide the ring onto it weeks before, except nothing about it felt plain now. "This ranch needed a wife, not a servant. That's what I told you the day I asked, and I meant it as a practical thing then. I mean something larger by it now. I don't want a woman managing my house because a bank clause required it. I want you because you're exactly who you are, careful with the truth, unwilling to be handled better with a ledger than I'll ever be, and steadier in a fire than any man I've ridden beside. I chose you, Amara. Whatever reason brought us to that courthouse, that's not why I'm still here." She held his gaze a long moment, feeling the particular weight of being seen plainly and completely, not as a solution to someone else's problem, not as help arriving just in time, but as herself chosen deliberately, and said so out loud. "I spent a long time being told I wasn't quite what anyone was looking for," she said. "I came out here believing I'd have to make myself smaller to be wanted anywhere. I'm not interested in going back to believing that." She turned her hand in his palm to palm. "I chose this too, Jed. Not just the terms. You." Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along Horsehead Road, and somewhere past the dark line of the North Range. The grass that had burned would come back green come spring, the way burned prairie always did, stronger in places for having been tested. Amara Fields. Colton sat in the kitchen that had become entirely her own, in a marriage that had begun as a bargain and become through nothing more dramatic than steady honesty and one terrible night of smoke the truest thing either of them had built. She had been rejected on a train platform by people who decided from a distance, and without ever truly knowing her, that she wasn't what they wanted. She understood now what she hadn't fully understood then, that being wanted for the wrong reasons had never been worth chasing, and being chosen for the right ones, however slowly it arrived, was worth everything it had cost to wait for.
That's the story of Amara Fields and Jedediah Colton. And if there's one thing I hope you carry away from it, is this: the people who decide you're not quite that what they wanted were never actually seeing you clearly in the first place. Somewhere out there is someone who will look at exactly who you are and call that enough without asking you to be smaller or softer or easier to manage. Amara didn't find that by chasing it. She found it by staying steady, telling the truth even when it cost her, and refusing to string herself down to fit spaces that were never going to hold her anyway. I would love to know where you're watching from tonight. Rub your city and stay in the comments. I read every one of them. If this story found you at the right moment, hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you too. I've got another one coming soon, and I think you're going to love where it takes us. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.